Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. My guests today are once again Dr. John Dunlosky and Dr. Regan Gurung, two of the world's leading experts on how people really learn. In today's episode, we dig into why hoping for transfer never works and how to train directly for it, how to break the content obsession and purposely build in reflection, retrieval, and application to any learning activity, and how strategies like interleaving and spacing play out in real workplaces, not just in research labs. We also discuss the truth about music and learning, brain training apps, and memory hacks, and what works, what doesn't, and when mnemonics backfire. So if you're a manager, trainer, or a lifelong learner, this episode is for you. It's going to help you move from consuming information to building learning routines that actually transfer and get the learning to stick. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. I've heard, well, to get in a study habit, you have to study in the same place at the same time each day, and that helps. But from the research, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you mix up the time that you study, the places that you study, the people you're studying with, it forms a more indelible memory. It helps you to recall it easier because you're recalling it in different situations, different circumstances where you're likely to use it. So does that help with the recall of information at the appropriate time, or does that really have no effect?
That small effect size is still not going to get most people to what their true learning goal is. So one thing that was making me relatively unpopular in the field, I think, I don't want to say making fun of small effect sizes because my whole career is just small effect sizes, but trying to remind people that I could have a cool technique that beats yours. I just showed it scientifically because my students significantly do 2% better. So my students get a 68%, then Regan's 65%. Someone should point out that all our students are failing and none of them had really learned it. So what I'd like us to do as a community, still talk about effect sizes because at the end of the day, that's what publications are made of and that's how we do our science and so forth. But instead of only talking about effect sizes, let's talk about, is this technique going to get the students to where they need to be? Is it going to really provide the basis to allow them to learn to a level of depth that they can use that content? And I would say a lot of this stuff is not going to help them that much. Now, if you just happen to have a study mate who is really an expert at something and you're studying with them for that reason, they could be outrageously beneficial because now you have another teacher. It's when I should get training for the things I do, like guitar, but I'm playing with so many people that are better than I am, that train me and tell me when I'm doing wrong things, right? So it's like doing it on my own would be great, but you get together for hopefully bootstrapping yourself up with other people. Still, note that a lot of these things are small effect sizes, and yes, they're bragging rights at your conference, but they're not bragging rights in the classroom. When students don't want to just get 2% better, they want knowledge and we'll say a passing grade or whatever grade they want. I don't want to demean the comparison between these. But when we're talking about these small effect sizes, sometimes I just don't think they're educationally relevant. But that's very opinion-based, by the way. Exclamation point on that. Regan might be thinking I'm crazy right now.
I think your comment about effect size is so important. People say to me, oh, should I study with music? How about this one? Should I study and chew gum? Chewing gum is somehow a lot of students have heard about a few little studies about how chewing gum increases attention a little bit. And that's why I say that effect size thing is great. Sure, some studies show that chewing gum, especially mint, will increase your attention a smidgen. But there are some much, much bigger ways that you can increase your attention. Namely, stop texting and scrolling reels every 3 minutes. That'll do it. The effect size of not scrolling TikTok is probably many, many more times than you popping some gum in your mouth. And that's why that is so important to keep in mind.
Well, and you mentioned something too about music, and you hear about the Mozart effect and that certain types of music will help you focus and concentrate more than others. I haven't seen that supported by the research at all. So maybe you can dispel or support that notion that, is there any kind of music that supports and accelerates learning?
And if a student or a person is going to be more likely to study with a little music in the background, put the music on. That's the big effect size. Am I engaged at all? Now, I would assume, and I have not done research on this, maybe Regan knows more about this. I'd assume once that music is distracting, then it's going to hurt more than it helps. But no, the Mozart effect and so forth, that's certainly, there's no evidence to really back that up. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to show that, in fact, it doesn't. It's not a real thing. It sounds great, right? It's sexy, but it's not real.
Well, another one that is a lot of misconceptions, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, is the brain training apps like the luminosities or the drugs like what you see in the movies. As far as I know, there's no supplements that's going to increase your mental or cognitive capacity. And these brain training apps are near transfer. There's not far transfer, and it doesn't help with your overall cognitive abilities or increase that cognitive limit, correct?
Absolutely correct.
I did want to say the one thing about music, and John and I have talked about this in the couple of years since the book came out, is a question we get very often, and I'm sure many of your listeners will be thinking this, is I have heard that for people with ADHD, music is better. And I think that's a really important question because a lot of individuals with ADHD have prescribed listening to music because it helps with focus. So I think that's something important to put on the table. But the newest research, and I'm talking literally last couple of years, last year or so, is showing that for many individuals who are distracted, who do have trouble focusing, who will have an ADHD diagnosis, there are some helpful benefits to music that are different from, I think, what we've been talking about. So that's a really important asterisk to put in there.
Right. Thank you, Regan, for bringing that up because, yes, definitely. And for certain individuals, certain neurodiverse individuals, that could be a benefit to them. I love how your book, you pair low utility tactics with stronger strategies. In school, two of the most common ones that everyone does is rereading and highlighting. But when you pair them with space, they can be quite effective. So talk to me about that, how highlighting and rereading can be paired with some of the more effective ones that you both mentioned to offer a very effective learning strategy moving forward, whether you're reading a book, taking a class, or maybe taking an e-course.
So if you're only familiar with the 2013 monograph and skimmed it, you might get the sense that we were really negative on highlighting and rereading, and we kind of were in that context. But I've got my favorite highlighter. I love it. I use it all the time. I reread a lot. So there's something to these things. And one thing the monograph did, and any kind of evaluation of individual techniques, is they don't put the learner in the larger learning context, or we did not. If I could rewrite that monograph, there'd be things I would do different. I'm not sure if my co-authors would want that, and what I kept saying after the fact is, no, highlighting can be very useful if it's the beginning of the journey, because you highlight what you need to learn. Highlighting itself is probably not going to help you learn it that well, but it's to identify, to pull out the most important things. Pretty much all of the strategies that we say are highly effective, like successive relearning, they involve rereading. You've got to reread stuff. If you don't retain it, you got to go back to it. The difficulty with rereading as a standalone and not as a supplement is part of the whole cadre of different strategies you'd want to use, is that what's surprising is that rereading on its own can lead to this sense of familiarity and understanding that could be demotivating. Just rereading is not so good. And sometimes rereading doesn't even boost memory for the content that you've read over just reading it a single time. Again, highlighting versus not highlighting often doesn't change your memory for that. But yeah, if I'm a learner, the first thing I would want to do is go figure out in a book, let's pull out all the stuff I need to learn and now use these more effective techniques to go learn that content. The difficulty is that if you just think you can learn it on the first pass through by highlighting, you're probably going to have unfortunate outcomes. So highlighting and rereading, not bad, but they're just part of the entire learner's, say, toolbox. They're very critical tools, I think, but they're just not the most effective on their own. I don't know, Regan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I have a very simple mantra. Instead of yes and no, I say yes to retrieval practice and spacing, say less to rereading and highlighting. Bam. That's it. Don't throw them out. Don't, shun somebody because they're highlighting. But, you get a big corporate manual that's this thick. Some highlighting and little tabs, probably very helpful to you to direct your attention on what to focus to.
Critical.
Well, when used this way, highlighting and rereading become kind of the front end scaffolds for real learning engines of retrieval, spacing, and reflection. So don't abandon the familiar, upgrade it. Use your highlights to drive testing, use your rereads to power spacing, use summaries to spark explanation, and really leverage those strategies that you're already using and pairing them with more effective proven methods as well. How about for memorization? Because a lot of memory champions are releasing these books on memory, on how to have a better memory. It's based on very elaborate mnemonics. Some of the leading cognitive scientists I've interviewed state that should be a last resort for the nonsensical information. Use the mnemonics there because you have to scaffold them. You have to learn these strategies, which takes more time. But I find that when I'm learning information and when I can visualize it easily, these strategies are pretty effective to help with the remembering of it. So, talk to me more about these mnemonic strategies. Are they effective for everyone to remember better, or is it just really used in very isolated and specialized cases in memory competition?
That's a great question. First, they're fun. Okay, let's the method of loci. For those of you listeners don't know this, a way you would use method of loci, and I'm going to put this in simple terms, learning a grocery list, for instance. By the way, if you want to learn your grocery list, you have some issues, right? You should write stuff down and just take a piece of paper with you. But let's say you want to learn your grocery list. So the method of loci, you would first memorize loci. And typically how this would be done, you would take a mental walk through your house, right? Maybe starting at your front door, and at the front door, there's a hanger there, a post. Then you walk to the kitchen and there's your oven. And when you do this mental travel, you'd see on your little post, you might see bananas hanging on it. Okay, so that's the first loci has bananas that I need to remember. Then you walk to your oven, and in the oven, you put grapes in there, right? So now when I get to the grocery store, I go through my mental loci again. It's like, okay, what was on the post? Oh, I put bananas there. I need to get bananas. Then you walk right to your oven and you open the oven. There are grapes. Okay. So that's a very simple use of the method of loci. And of course, you would have a large map in your head, not just two locations, but probably 20 or 30. And you would typically connect each location with a lot more content. So they could be used really effectively and can really be impressive. So if you want to impress friends with your incredible memory, you could use the method of loci. The amount of effort that it takes to actually memorize these locations is quite tremendous, right? So you're doing all this work just so you can memorize something else. That never sat well with me, right? Plus, it turns out, okay, well, I've gone to the grocery store. I used my loci for that trip. Well, I got to go to the grocery store tomorrow. So how do I erase my memory, right? So now the strategy is becoming more cumbersome than its benefits, unless you want to sell a book on mnemonics. Because then you can use these and press people and say, look, learning stuff is easy as long as you spend the 100 hours that I took to learn all these loci. So do I think those kinds of mnemonics are useful? Not really. If you're in theater, they could be extremely useful. Now, often the method of loci is matched with imagery, is what you're talking about, where I visualize my post with the bananas on it. It turns out that visual imagery is relatively general and it can be effective in lots of applications, but only those applications that you can visualize. Imaging something that you're trying to learn, it's relatively cost-free because you're not developing new loci, you're just coming up with a mental image of it. It can actually benefit your memory. So it just turns out that I don't think it's a very broadly useful technique because most things we need to learn are not really concrete, right? Certainly the grocery list is, you can image a banana, but most things we learn, like say chemistry, aside from molecules, good luck. When I'm learning the content, if it's concrete, I would try to image it. Those more highfalutin mnemonics, I don't know. I did use them as a student, but then all I did was study as a student. I wasn't very effective at all. And I thought those were cool. No one else did. No one else thought they were cool.
Well, you're right. It requires a heavy lift and a lot of that effort up front that you have to do just to be able to use them effectively. And when you see a memory champion memorizing a deck of cards in 30 seconds, that's a great parlor trick. But how useful is it in the real world when you want to remember things that you need to remember and they don't lend itself well to abstract concepts? Good luck, right? In remembering that image over a period of time and recalling it quite easily.
Even these mnemonists who are experts, okay, when you put them through challenges or a challenge they've never had before. I had one of my wife's grad students, Mary Pick, actually worked with these individuals. And one of the individuals she worked with failed this card memorizing trick, right? He couldn't do it. The next day, he came and he mastered it. And she's like, what happened in just a night? He said, I spent all night coming up with a mnemonic that could be useful in this context. So these memory experts are just incredible mnemonists driven, and they work so hard. Let's say if you want to become a mnemonist, I hope your parents are still alive and you could live in their basement, because that's a really good place to spend your time developing all these mnemonics and learning how to memorize cards and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, in some countries, you can make quite a bit of money doing it. I mean, it's a real sport. I'd rather learn chemistry than the order of a deck of cards, but whatever.
And I think that's I love the fact that you so highlighted the fact that it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of ways to spend that effort. Long and short, the story is there are a lot less effortful ways for daily memorization than going the method of loci route.
You're right. We also need to remember, which I don't think gets talked enough with learning, that it's just not a cognitive function. It's a mindset that a lot of people bring into this that people don't recognize initially. Talk to me more about the mindset, and with Carol Dweck's work, the growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. That's gotten a lot of play throughout the years. But really, it's a whole body, whole brain process that affects your learning. It's not just having these great learning strategies, but what are you doing for your body, for your emotions, and that mindset that's so critical that you bring to the learning experience.
Yeah, this kind of brings us back to some of the misconceptions too, which I love. The one emotion I have while I'm learning is that of frustration, right? And that's what I want to tell everyone out there. You will be frustrated if you're going about it in the right way. And what I see younger students doing is they turn that frustration into a I'm not smart mantra, or I can't learn mantra, instead of a, hey, learning is difficult, but I'm capable, because everyone is capable. Even with all those individual differences out there, using the right techniques and strategies are going to level that playing field, right? But having these kinds of emotions that could like drag you away from learning because it's frustrating is part of the equation. We cannot ignore those. Just focusing on learning strategies in their own right and ignoring the emotions that come into play, the actual time constraints that people have in trying to learn content would be horrible, because it is a engaging process that is fraught with failure. So there's going to be a lot of negative emotion. Hopefully, though, at least I know this from anecdotes, when students start using the right strategies and they do it tenaciously, that frustration turns into elation and actually, quite frankly, disbelief that they could learn so well, because it's an epiphany. Just using the strategy, I too can become a memory expert.
Well, and I think, Charles, you mentioned the growth mindset. I think the growth mindset has been bandied around so much that we forget about some other really important psychological variables that are important here. Self-efficacy, the belief that you can do something, your self-evaluation or self-esteem, your belief in yourself and how you respond to failure of learning. So self-efficacy, self-esteem, these are really important psychological variables that I think we've got to keep in mind when we're trying to get a bunch of people to learn something. And, I think we forget that if we're mentally unhealthy or physically unhealthy, or we're not eating right, or we're not getting physical activity or practicing mindfulness, and my favorite that I love to think about and talk about all the time is if we don't feel supported. Social support's a big deal. And whether you're in a corporation with coworkers or in a classroom with teachers and peers, how supported you feel sets the environment for learning to take place. And we learn better when we feel supported. We learn better when we believe we can do it, self-efficacy. And I think that's why it's not just the strategies. And, with all due respect to my cognitive scientist, cognitive science is big, but we can't forget about the health psych and the social psych and all those other elements in there.
And that's so important. You're right, is looking at the whole package. And that's really critical to understand. It's the health side, it's the self-efficacy. Do I have the belief that I can do it? Is there the social support? Which you're right, Regan, never gets talked about, or gets talked about very little. So it's important to bring all those into bear, into mind. as you're trying to optimize that learning environment. John, looking back at your 2013 review of learning techniques, if you could update it today for adult learners in the workplace, what would you update about it?
I think as far as an update, I don't know what I would do with it. I think it's a pretty good standalone. Science has gone on for the last 10 plus years and is largely, in my mind, supported our array of conclusions. I think the only thing I would change, and alluded to this earlier, is being very careful about the implications of our conclusions. Don't throw away your highlighter. Use it in a different way. Just don't use it to learn. Things like that I don't think people got our initial message. If anything, I'd just like to see more techniques evaluated, or what I'd like to see in front of that at the end of that monograph is, here's how to get your students to use the best ones. For you adults listening to this, you be your own regulator, use the best techniques and go after it. And part of that is add the front and back end, talking about goal setting and planning, which kind of drives everything.
I love that. And I interviewed Ayelet Fishbach out of University of Chicago. She does a lot on motivation research, and a lot of things come into bear with learning as well, that you need to get the planning, the goal setting right for it to really happen and take place. Regan, from your corporate experience and the students that you've taught, have you found any proven strategies that really sustains how managers can manage their learning better?
Well, I think to take the holistic approach that I mentioned, I'm going to add a key word here, which is mentoring. I think managers need to think about how they can be good mentors, and good mentors are supportive. Good mentors do build self-efficacy. And that's probably the single biggest thing is when I've started carving up more and more time when I do workshops and things like that in talking about being a good mentor and providing support and being aware of the other things beyond specific strategies. That's what I think makes a difference, because just like you said it before, we don't talk about those enough, and we need to make it more normative.
And what can you offer in terms of advice in leveraging technology as a coach, not a crutch? Because we talked about it a little bit before with AI and ChatGPT. Are there any platforms, technology that you would recommend that's really going to help and accelerate your learning?
Charles, there are a lot of apps out there that can be used to help support learning, and I'm an advocate of most of them because they do a pretty good job of allowing students to input what they need to learn, and then they help students out. That said, I would be very happy to share a paper we wrote about the learning apps that just goes over their attributes. So if I were looking for one right now, knowing my own weaknesses as a learner, I would want to make sure that that app reminded me when I should study, right? So it would have the built-in schedule. I would want that app to keep track of how well I was doing on different content, right? So I could grade myself. There are apps that do all of these things, right? And so I would rely on applications now. I think if I rewound time, so to speak, and went back in time, I think I would be using them a lot as a student, right? Whereas the technology I used before was a highlighter and Post-it notes, right? Now the technology's improved quite a bit. So yeah, I don't want to mention anyone in particular because I'm not here trying to sell these apps. There are a lot out there that are free that provide a lot of scaffolding to help people stay motivated and keep on track.
Yeah, and I'd actually say my recommendation would be, listeners, figure out what you need. Which elements of what we've talked about do you most need? It may be that you're a procrastinator. Well, you need to tackle that. Maybe you don't take good notes. Maybe you need to tackle that. Something that John and I did is yoked to the book is a free website with a whole bunch of self-assessments. And Charles, I'll send you the link so that you can maybe attach it to when you post this. But you can go to that site and find out, are you a good note taker? What are your study strategies? Are you a procrastinator? And the other things we talked about, are you getting enough social support? Do you have good coping strategies? Know what you need, and then there's an app for that.
And I love that, Regan, about the book as well, because you have to establish these baselines. You aren't a good judge of what you know and don't know and where your strengths and weaknesses are. So love the assessments that you give, and I'll make sure I include all of that in the paper that John mentioned in the show notes. The second to last question I have is, what do you see in learning science in the next 5 years? What would you hope that it conquers, that it overcomes, or any breakthrough that you see coming up on the horizon?
What I'd like to see, this is a fantasy based, how about an impeccably conducted demonstration that not having knowledge really undermines people's effectiveness. That is, just relying on looking stuff up, right? And we know that works in many contexts, but to think that it could actually be useful in all contexts is really, I think, undermining students' motivation to learn, because I could just look this stuff up on the web. I think we need to know more about that. When is the right time to look things up? And when is the right time to know them? Right? I think that's a whole program of research waiting for some grad student to take over at some point.
Mine is a little bit more idealistic. I would love to see the answer to the question, what is the importance of being human? And I know that sounds highly philosophical, but in this age of AI and AI tutors and AI companions and asynchronous online classes, do we still need human teachers and trainers? And I would say absolutely, but let's get the data showing that.
If there's one practical takeaway that you want listeners taking away from our conversation today that they could start tomorrow to improve their learning, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say plan well and know what you don't know. That's the most important starting place.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the planning. Know when you're going to study, right? Know when you're going to engage, and stick to your plan. That's good for anything.
Well, thank you both so much for being a part of the conversation today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
So I'm, as you guys know, John Dunlosky. Just write me, jdunlosky@kent.edu. Just send me an email. I always answer, although now that I'm retired, I'm a little bit slow on answering email.
And I think the single easiest way to get in touch with me is Regan.Gurung. That's REGAN.GURUNG.com. That's my website. Everything that I talked about, all those free assessments, everything's on there. Contact information is on there. And if you're intrigued by the importance of being human, my lab's doing a lot of studies on AI and learning and AI tutors. A lot of that stuff is on there as well. So check that out. And yeah, get in touch.
Wonderful. Thank both of you again for joining me, and thank all of you for listening, because growth doesn't come from consuming more information. It comes from installing better routines and learning science-based strategies. Because every professional can become their own learning scientist, designing these micro experiments, spacing practice, testing recall, and refining strategies in real time. Because when learning becomes self-regulated, performance stops being accidental, becomes predictable, repeatable, and transferable. And that's how modern professionals outlearn and outperform the competition. Thank you. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.